You know, there's an experiment that's always fascinated me. They take starlings, ordinary, unremarkable birds, and release them into a field. And suddenly they start moving as one, as if an invisible hand is conducting this living cloud. No rules, no patterns, just pure improvisation. And so I wonder, isn't this how our brain works when it hears music? We're used to thinking that music is just sounds. Well, melody, rhythm, harmony. But what if there's something more to it? What if every chord, every pause is an entire universe that our brain is building in real time? Here's a fact that few people realize: when you listen to Bach or, say, the Beatles, more neural connections are activated in your head than when you solve a complex math problem. Music and the brain are not just a connection, they're a symbiosis that evolution has been honing for millennia. Why do some melodies make us cry, while others make us dance? Why do Alzheimer's patients, no longer recognizing their loved ones, suddenly start singing old songs? Neuroscience is just beginning to get to the bottom of these mysteries. But it is already clear, music is not an adornment of life. It is the language in which our brain speaks to itself. And sometimes screams. When Schnittke said that a masterpiece is born from a mistake, he probably did not suspect how accurately he described the work of neurons. Our brain also creates pearls from chaos, from contradictions, from these very mistakes. And music is the best ally here. So let's figure out how it works. Without simplifications, without myths. Only facts, hypotheses, and those very inconvenient questions that science has no answers to yet. Well, imagine, you hear the first chords of the Moonlight Sonata. For the ear, these are just vibrations of the air. But your brain, it does more than just hear. He builds. He constructs entire worlds from the fragments of memory, emotions, cultural codes. We live in a strange illusion that music is somewhere outside. In the speakers, in the notes, in the Stradivarius violin. But in reality it does not exist. At all. Until your brain decides to create it. Here's an example: a patient with amusia. His hearing is perfect, his intellect is intact. But for him, Mozart's Symphony No. 40 is just the bark of a drill behind the wall. No, this is not a problem with his ears. It is the brain that has refused to decipher it. And now the other pole, synesthetes. For them, C-sharp smells of cinnamon, and a minor triad is painted the color of old gold. Their brain has mixed up the rules. Or maybe, on the contrary, it has added those that we lost somewhere in childhood? When Akhtomsky said, "There is no subject without an object," he was talking about exactly this. Without a trained brain, Bach is just a set of frequencies. Without a cultural code, rock and roll is a noise attack. And here's the paradox: our brain hates emptiness. In the pauses between notes, it draws the sound. In an unfamiliar melody, it looks for familiar patterns. Even in sleep, and did you know that the hippocampus plays daytime melodies in the REM phase? It continues this work. So who is the composer here? A man with a pen in his hand, or a trillion neurons that decide how we hear it? When Einstein got stuck on a complex formula, he picked up the violin. Not for rest, no. He knew that fingers sliding along the strings restructure the brain. Literally. Here's a fact that boggles the mind. After a year of music lessons, children experience an increase in the volume of gray matter in the areas responsible for memory and motor skills. At a microscopic level. Neurons grow new shoots like trees in the spring. But the strangest thing happens with the corpus callosum. This thick neural highway between the hemispheres is a third denser in musicians. Imagine a bridge that expands under load. That is why a pianist can play a melody with one hand and the rhythm with the other without losing the rhythm. And now the bad news. If you stop practicing, these changes disappear. The brain mercilessly disassembles unused connections. Like an attic where you haven't been for years. But there are also good ones. Even at 60, 70, 80, neurons are ready to grow. Slower, yes. But they grow. Here's a story from practice. A patient after a stroke could not say hello. But he sang happy birthday without a single mistake. Because the song lived in other neural networks. Those that were not damaged. Music is not just a decoration of life. It is a tool for rebuilding your own brain. Roughly speaking, we can resolder ourselves like a microcircuit. Scary? Of course. But also amazing. Have you ever caught yourself unable to get an obsessive tune out of your head? It's not just that. Your brain at that moment behaves like a drug addict demanding another fix. Dopamine. It is this neurotransmitter that makes us listen to our favorite song 20 times in a row. An interesting paradox: the brain gets pleasure not so much from the music itself, but from the anticipation of a familiar moment. Those goosebumps before the climax, this is the dopamine surge. But there is a dark side. Some people really do become music addicts. They experience real withdrawal without their favorite tunes. In my practice, there was a patient who could not work in silence. He literally began to shake. Now imagine what happens in the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease. Memory is destroyed, connections are broken. But musical memories often remain intact. Why? Because they are stored in special protected areas associated with emotions. An even more amazing case is Tourette's syndrome. When medications are powerless, sometimes Mozart helps. The rhythmic structures of his music literally reboot disobedient neurons. But the strangest phenomenon is musical hallucinations. Older people often complain that they hear old songs that do not actually exist. Their brain, like a broken record, reproduces long-forgotten melodies. What is this, if not a real addiction? Only in this case, it is a saving one. Artists have always known what science is only now getting to the bottom of. Take the Impressionists: they painted the world not as they saw it, but as the brain perceived it. Blurred brushstrokes, play of light, this is a ready-made manual on the neurophysiology of vision. Proust in his Remembrance of Lost Time described the mechanisms of memory 100 years before neurobiologists discovered how the smell of Madeleine activates the hippocampus. He simply felt how consciousness works. And Schoenberg? When he broke traditional harmony, he actually anticipated modern research on how the brain processes dissonances. Our minds crave predictability, but at the same time seek novelty. This paradox has been intuitively used by composers for centuries. But here's what's interesting: today's science is starting to catch up with art. Modern tomographs show that the brain of a jazz improviser works completely differently from that of a classical musician. At the moment of spontaneous play, self-control zones are switched off almost like in trance states. Who is ahead of whom? Perhaps this is a false dichotomy. True understanding is born only at the junction when a scientist looks at tomography data with the eyes of a poet, and a musician listens to his chords with the ears of a neurophysiologist. In the end, both Einstein and Bohr admitted that their main discoveries came not through calculations, but through some almost artistic insights. They simply knew that the formula should be beautiful. Like a symphony. What was the first sound our ancestors heard? The sound of the surf? The whisper of leaves? Or maybe, our own voice. There is a theory that we began to sing before we spoke. Archaeologists have found flutes that are 40,000 years old, long before the emergence of complex speech. Why? Perhaps rhythmic sounds help the tribe synchronize, like those same starlings in a flock. Absolute pitch in infants is a mystery. Why does a newborn need to distinguish halftones? Perhaps this is how nature tested the auditory system. But by 6 months, this ability disappears in most people. The brain switches to more important tasks, such as speech recognition. But the most amazing thing is how music physically changed our brain. When a person first hit a stone against a stone in rhythm, new neural pathways began to form in his brain. The same ones that later allowed us to create mathematics, poetry, computer codes. Parrots. They are the ones who ask uncomfortable questions. Some of them don't just repeat sounds, but compose their own melodies. Is this a coincidence or echoes of a common mechanism? We think we've tamed music. Or maybe it's music that's tamed us? Made us smarter, more sensitive, more complex. After all, even today, in the era of artificial intelligence, no algorithm can create real music. Only imitate it. Somewhere in the depths of the brain, that very first rhythm still sounds the beating of a mother's heart, to which we developed for millions of years. And when we hear a bass line, this ancient code wakes up. How many times have you heard the advice, listen to Mozart for your brain? This is not just an old wives' tale. When a pregnant woman turns on classical music, her baby's brain actually forms additional neural connections. But there is a nuance here, it is not what you listen to, but how. Take a regular morning. You check your email with background music and your brain works on autopilot. Now try something else, put on a complex piece and listen actively, tracking individual instruments. Just 15 minutes of such conscious listening a day, and after a month, tests will show a 20 to 25% improvement in memory. Approximate data, but the trend is confirmed by research. Sleeping with music is a separate story. Slow compositions with a tempo of 60 beats per minute, like a resting heartbeat, really improve the quality of deep sleep. But only if it is instrumental music without words. Verbal information overloads the brain even in sleep. But what really works without reservations is playing instruments. It doesn't matter if you started at age 5 or 50. The process of learning to play triggers such cascades of neural connections that no passive listening can compare to. Your fingers move, the brain is rebuilt. You read notes, the visual cortex learns to process information differently. Music therapy for the elderly is no longer an experiment, but a standard practice in many clinics. Patients with dementia, who have not spoken a word for years, begin to sing along to old songs. The mechanism is not completely clear, but it is a fact. Musical memories hide in those parts of the brain that resist neurodegeneration the longest. The simplest advice? Stop using music as a background. At least 10 minutes a day, only music and nothing else. Let your brain completely immerse itself in this flow. Over time, you will notice a strange thing. You will begin to hear better not only the notes, but also your own thoughts. We are on the verge of a strange discovery. What if music is not just an art, but a forgotten language of our species? The language we started losing as soon as we learned to write down words. In laboratories today, we can already see how a musician's brain glows on tomograms with entire constellations of active zones. But the paradox is that the more we study these processes, the more obvious it becomes. Music does not live in any specific areas of the brain. It arises somewhere between neurons, in these fleeting impulses that no one has yet learned to record. When a patient with amnesia hears Beethoven as the rattling of dishes, and an Alzheimer's patient suddenly remembers the entire lyrics of a song from his youth, what is this if not proof that we still do not understand the main thing? Maybe that old professor was right when he said that music is not what sounds, but what happens between sounds? Modern studies show that children who study music are, on average, 15% better at solving logical problems. But what if we are measuring the wrong thing? What if it's not about developing intelligence, but about music teaching the brain to exist in a state of between logic and emotion, between order and chaos? Here's a final experiment to ponder. When a person dies, hearing is the last thing to go. Perhaps in these moments, somewhere deep in the cortex, that very first melody that our species heard tens of thousands of years ago still sounds. And then the question arises, have we been creating music all these centuries, or has it been creating us?